name's William Martin. I live in Washington, D.C., and I'm chairman of Washington Policy and Analysis, which is an energy and foreign policy think tank which serves clients in Japan, Europe, and in the United States. I started at the Wharton School of University of Pennsylvania, and I went on to MIT, and I was an economic modeler, very interested in sustainability. How do we account, for example, to the social costs of the things that we do that aren't necessarily in the economic structure? I wrote 3 books in the 1970s with MIT Press focused on this question of how we have a sustainable future. Not just all green, but how do we have sustainable jobs? How do we have sustainable livelihoods, sustainable families? And later carried out this work in the OECD in Paris. Following that, I joined the White House as an economist focused on making the Soviet Union unsustainable. I later became head of state meetings for Ronald Reagan, had a chance to meet 10, 12 foreign leaders, including Mrs. Thatcher, Nakasone, the president of Sri Lanka, and others. And I had a methodology to prepare the president over a period of weeks, not just giving him a briefing book the night before. After that, I continued my interest in sustainability, personal sustainability, because I had to make a living, and formed Washington Policy and Analysis. But during this particular time, around the Rio Summit of 1992, I teamed up with Morris Strong, who put together the Rio Summit, which really, in my view, was the beginning of concerns about climate change, biodiversity, and other environmental features. I later succeeded Morris Strong as president of the Council of the University of Peace. Here we have 300 graduate students a year. We teach them sustainability, gender issues, gun control, all sorts of good things. And I was on the board and president for 8 years in Costa Rica. Since that time, I've been very involved with many think tanks around the world, including one in the Czech Republic that I started with the president of the Czech Republic, Václav Havel. You may recall Havel was the key leader coming out of the fall of the Berlin Wall. He was a playwright, became president of Czechoslovakia in 2000. At that time, he asked me to form a school to teach Czech students national security issues, and I'm proud to report that we have trained over 1,000 Czechs in national security. Later, I went on to use this school to train Iraqi judges at the time of Iraq War, and indeed, we brought 200 judges back to Prague to try to teach them how to take care of their country after the end of Saddam Hussein. Lastly, and more recently, I've been involved a lot with nuclear matters. I was deputy secretary of the Department of Energy. I ran a department of 150,000 people during my tenure with Ronald Reagan. This agency was involved with nuclear weapon development as well as energy policy. So when the disastrous Fukushima nuclear accident occurred in Japan, I became an advisor to the Japanese government on how to contain the radioactivity emerging from that plant and also regain the soil at safe levels. So that has been one of my primary responsibilities of the last 10 years. A lot of the analytical work on environment began at MIT in the early 1970s. There was a model called Limits to Growth, and it analyzed 5 different key factors of humanity. One was population growth, one was environmental growth, growth of arable land, growth of environmental pollution, and the growth of economic activity. And if you put these all together in a systemic model, you begin to see how one part of your equation affects another. This book was a bestseller. 35 countries published it in their language. I was responsible for the follow-up book. It was done for something called the Club of Rome. And at that time, I realized I was 22 years old, that I was going to live, hopefully a long time, and see some of these dynamics occur. And that unless we leveled off, basically, we're talking about the pandemic now, leveling off the pandemic, very similar to sustainable growth. So at that time, it was around 1973, I became involved with the first United Nations Environmental Conference in Stockholm, the man named Morris Strong, and actually did the first book for the United Nations Environmental Program on teaching materials about the environment. Sustainability takes many forms. You need to have quite a complicated model now. And it's, as I say, it's not just environmental green sustainability, it's how we have jobs, how we have businesses, how we put, for example, in a world of 10 billion people that we're going to have by the year 2100, how we're going to find jobs for them. I mean, think of it. Today we have 7 billion people. Within 70 years, we're going to have 10 billion. Where do those people have jobs? So indeed, if they don't have jobs, are they going to become extremists? Does that feed back into terrorism? Or, for example, refugees fleeing their countries and coming to Europe and the United States? So I view really the issue of sustainability, in my mind, has grown from green to a much larger sense. Now, this is very challenging for policymakers because we think linearly. We don't think in terms of systems. We attack one problem after another, and sometimes we solve one problem and we create another. I mean, we're trying to help with employment now with putting in lots of money into our economy because we need to put people to work and give them a check. But on the other hand, we're going to have an inflationary challenge. We're going to have a debt problem, which we're going to put on future generations. So when I have advised presidents, and I've advised several presidents, I think every American president I have advised really since Ronald Reagan, and that includes Obama, I try to put this in the broader context, not just single issues. But it's a very hard thing to do, very challenging, but that's the direction we have to take. Well, I was very fortunate to work with Ronald Reagan, both as an economist, then as a personal assistant for all of his head of state meetings, and then as chief of staff of the National Security Council. My office was in the West Wing, so I got to see him every day. I was in the basement where we had the White House Situation Room, for example. Reagan was an actor to begin with, and he was older. And I think these two combinations made it quite effective as a leader. He could communicate. He was an easy person to be with. His wife was not, but that's another story. He had deep instincts, and he also understood his generation's concern about communism. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire. A lot of people thought that was pretty strange, but indeed the Soviet Union was an evil empire. But when he and I met Gorbachev in 1985 together, there was a warmth there of putting, again, relationships on a new footing and ending the Cold War. In 1983, for example, we thought we were going to have an exchange of nuclear weapons between the countries. 3 Soviet leaders had died and the military were in charge, and they heard Reagan's rhetoric about the evil empire, and they thought we were going to have a first attack. We knew this because we had something called Blue Line Intelligence that came in very secretly to the White House Situation Room, which had our spies on the Politburo reporting on their discussions. And I can remember telling Reagan, you know, Mr. President, maybe we better be a little careful here with the rhetoric. We, of course, had no intention to attack the Soviet Union, but they were taking this seriously. Now, in 1983, because of that, we thought communications was very important. So between 1983 and 1985, those were the critical period for ending the Cold War. So Reagan had a maturity to know when to make a decision. He also had a maturity to know when to use American force. In 1985, we were at a Christmas party in Palm Springs. I was acting national security advisor, and always the NSC aide has to go to the president wherever he is. And it was a party, and we had an airport attack in Rome and Vienna, and 40, 50 innocent women and children were killed. And I was the action officer. So Reagan and I spent 3 days together deciding what to do. There were no other advisors there. So the first day we learned that Abu Nidal, who was the Osama bin Laden of the day, he was the feared terrorist. We learned he was responsible for killing the children and men and women. The second day, we learned that Libya was responsible. Now, remember, information on a terrorist incident, it comes in piecemeal. You don't get all your facts at once. But by the third day, we had to do something. So I sat down with the president. And I said, you have 3 options, Mr. President. The first option is to go all-out war in Libya. And we had a plan called Operation Flower that was to work with Mubarak of Egypt, President Mubarak, and move Egyptian and American soldiers into Libya to take them over the same way the United States took over Iraq in 1992. The second option was to have economic sanctions. The third option was to say, quite a mature option, to say, well, wait, this happened in Rome and Vienna. So why don't we just let the Austrians and the Italians bring these people to justice? The president thought very hard and long, and he said, I think I'm going to go with the third option. This is not the time to spread violence in the region. And at about the same time, the Syrians had moved missiles into the Bekaa Valley, and they were threatening Israel, and Israel was threatening to attack the missiles. And Reagan said, tell Israel to stand down. This is not a time for violence. Now, if you go back in history, 2 months later, Americans were killed at La Belle Discotheque in Berlin. And then the president sent in 2 missiles into the Gaddafi compound. It was a tactical tit-for-tat approach. So I think the maturity of Reagan, who I think was the greatest leader, well, I think it's had a big impact. I was a big believer in computers. And in fact, in 1978, when I went to Paris, I took a little polymorphic 88 computer to Paris, had to do my own codes and everything. Of course, I'm an MIT trained guy, so I like codes. I think word processing, for example, began going in the early 80s, which gave us the opportunity to edit and go quickly. I mean, simple technologies like that. Having run the sit room, which is probably the most central intelligence apparatus in the world, maybe the Soviets have something comparable, but I've seen a tremendous change in the amount of information. When I started as exec sec of NSC, the chief of staff, we would probably get in 2,000 pieces of information daily. And I would get in at 6 in the morning and begin working with our staff officers to put together a 15-minute brief for the president of the highlights of the information of the last 24 hours. At that time, I talked with the head of CIA, a man named Bob Gates, later went on to be Secretary of Defense. I said, Bob, I don't want to have paper, I want video. You've done video for me for these trips. I want a video brief every night that the president can watch in 15 minutes, including satellite cameras and so forth and so on. And Bob said, well, Bill, we'd have to be a news organization. I said, Bob, you have 100,000 people. You're the spies. You have to take your information. If you want to be relevant with all the huge intelligence apparatus that you have, you've got to get it down to 15 minutes. But then the world didn't have as much open information. There was not the internet. Now I would suspect the information arriving in the White House sit room is 20 times that. Now what that does is it makes it a lot more confusing for the action officer. Now in the old days, if I wanted to get an assessment, let's say of Saudi Arabia or something, I'd ask the CIA, and the next day they would have something on my desk. Now people just go to Wikipedia. They don't ask the intelligence agencies. They want information so fast. So the entire intelligence apparatus is strained. A very important part of this process, and it involves technology, is the intelligence officer. I mean, let's look at the spy world. They're people that go out as spies. They collect information secretly. They have a dual identity. Then there are the people that analyze the data. These are really important people because they have to make sense of the universe of information. Technology helps with artificial intelligence. Technology helps with the NSA. The NSA is our secret organization that monitors cell phones. But you know something? They monitor a lot more than cell phones. They monitor bank accounts. You want to control the world? Control the banking system. All right? If you're a terrorist and you're known as a terrorist and you take your ATM card in and you put it in to get a little bit of money and the damn thing is chewed up by the NSA, you've been hit. Again, this whole issue of cybersecurity, we know what we can do now. In 1983, when I was working on hurting the Soviet economy, we put a cyber bug in the gas management system of the Soviet Union that wrecked the entire system and cut their natural gas exports in half. That's 1983. First use of, I think, of cyber was for this case. Later, I'll tell you another spy story. The Russians, we put compressors. Compressors are like turbines that move gas through a pipeline. Again, talking about technology. Big compressors can move more gas. So we put an embargo on those, including with Mrs. Thatcher. The Russians went on the black market to try to get some of these large compressors. CIA fixed a couple of them. And a few months later, Russians secretly bought these faulty compressors and they blew up, causing one of the most massive explosions ever in Siberia, which could be seen by space. Yes, we blew up pipelines. We put in cyber bugs. And you know why? Because energy is so fundamental. We wanted to kill the Soviet economy. And there's a great book about this called Peter Schweitzer's Victory. We won the Cold War by losing very few people. We beat them economically and we put them out of business, making them totally reliant on oil and gas. And you can see the Soviet economy today. So technology, for example, in the CIA, there's a whole division of science and technology. You remember those old James Bond films that I was raised on? There was always the secret British that were doing the secret guns and so forth. We live in that world only a million times more than that. But the problem is people can do it to us too. You know, people can, it's like nuclear. We were the only ones, the British, the French, the Americans, we had nuclear weapons, but now anybody has access through OpenStack on the internet, and anybody can build a weapon if they have the material. So technology is the curse and technology is the angel in so many dimensions. Well, the Fukushima benefited from the United States. I became an advisor because when I was Deputy Secretary of Energy, that's the minister basically of energy, we were making nuclear weapons. In 1986, I had a stockpile of 50,000 weapons, nuclear weapons. Now, since then, the weapons have come down. We were operating in 26 different states, all of which were red zones in terms of radioactivity. So one of the big issues after the Cold War was to clean up the radioactive mess. And we have great skills, great technology to do that. When Fukushima happened, the Japanese had no legacy of nuclear weapons or cleanup, so they turned to the United States. So we sent in teams from our national laboratories, from our universities, from our companies to clean up the site. And that has been going on now for 8 years. They have a great challenge here because they also have an underground water system which actually goes under the reactor and then spews out into the ocean radioactive water, small bits. So they've had this problem to contain. The Japanese have done a fabulous job, especially compared to Chernobyl. When I was Deputy Secretary of Energy when Chernobyl happened. But what it's done is it has stopped nuclear power and its footsteps. And honestly, nuclear power is very important because that's one of the largest possible energy sources for non-carbon energy. So if we go back to the other interrelated issue of our time, climate or environmental quality or electricity for humanity, we need nuclear energy, but it has to be done safely. And not only does it have to be done safely from a technical point of view, it has to be done technically from a non-proliferation point of view. Nuclear power, which could solve climate change, could also end the world, or at least a city or two, with nuclear terrorism. So all of these decisions show you have to have national leadership. You need international leadership too. In a couple of weeks, we'll be having the G7. Trump will chair here in the United States. He'll have Boris Johnson. I'm very glad to see he's better. He'll have Abe. He'll have Macron. He'll have Trudeau from Canada. These leaders have really got to pull together. Now, that's the other complexity of international leadership today. How do you gain a consensus multilaterally? Very, very difficult, especially when leaders tend to be, kind of frowning at each other and very, very focused on their domestic agenda, as you are in the UK with Brexit. So how far can we go as individual countries? I've advised President Trump. I've said, you've got three points here, Mr. President. First point is we all put our own country first. Yes, absolutely. You are 100%. America first, Britain first, France first, Germany. But secondly, there are issues that we can do together that we have to do, whether it's the environment, whether it's refugee affairs, whether it's the pandemic, that enhance our country. By working with other countries, we do not diminish our country. We need to find that very special set of issues where we enhance ourselves in the G7. And thirdly, we have to look globally. In the year 2100, there will be 1 billion people in Europe, North America, Japan. There will be 9 billion people everywhere else. Well, if the 9 billion people are not healthy, or if they're hungry, they're gonna encroach on us. It may be pandemics, it may be refugee affairs. They may flee to Europe, flee to the United States. We have to have a world for the 10 billion people. I think that is the challenge of our time, and that goes back to sustainability. That goes back 50 years ago when I started my research at MIT. It hasn't changed. It hasn't changed at all. Well, the challenge with it is we didn't anticipate the crisis well. I mean, the key to crisis planning is pre-crisis planning, right? Well, now, once you're in the soup, you're in trouble because you're always in catch-up mode. This happens more often than not, and that's exactly where we are. I think a very good G7 is a start here in 2 weeks where the leaders come together. Maybe Boris Johnson can give his personal experience. We need to tackle this, and we need to find a balance between health and economy. Again, that to me, if I were a policymaker, would be the most difficult because we really still don't know about the origins of the virus and so forth. So I think getting the scientific community collaborating internationally, again, I go back to we're a great country, but we need our partners. And we certainly are going to need help from China as well. So before we start bashing China too much, we have to realize that part of the solution is understanding this with them. We have to work with them. That goes back again, how do we as leaders deal with our own company and yet the bigger economy? My son does online learning and conference planning. He's having boom days because of this now. I mean, everybody wants to do online conferencing. He has the technology he's been developing for 10 years. He's going to benefit, but the airlines, the hospitality industry, the conferencing people, these are going to be troublesome time. And if they're unhappy and unemployed, how do we have the shift from jobs that are going to be put out of business to jobs that are sustainable? So it's way beyond my capability, but I'm sure we have good people in our governments that are putting this together. You see, it's again, thinking systemically. We cannot think linearly in this crisis or we'll all be dead. But thinking systemically is very tough. When a cabinet meets, for example, I went to many cabinet meetings in my life. You have 10 smart men and women around a table. They all have their personal background. They tend to have personal ideologies too. And they tend to argue very much the same way, dependent on the issue. They need to broaden out themselves, first of all, to think more broadly, think more holistically, think not just of the economy, but health, not just of health, but the economy, and bring something to the table. You know, the most magical thing in the world is to be a cabinet officer. And you know why? Because people think, oh, I'm the Minister of Health or Minister of Treasury. Well, yes, you do have your responsibility to your ministry, but you also come together as a cabinet. You have to think in terms of the good of the government. I'll give you an example with AIDS, HIV. I was on the National AIDS Commission in 1986. I was, the Minister of Energy, not Health. But the Minister of Health was not a very articulate man. He was a man who was a doctor. And he said, if I go in and make this suggestion, I'm just going to get killed at the cabinet table, but will you make this proposal for me? And then I can defend you. And I said, what's your proposal, Dr. Bowen? He said, well, 40% of the HIV victims in New York are drug users. So what we need to do is to give clean needles, right? And we can stop the AIDS crisis in New York. So I made this proposal at cabinet level because so many of the people were ideologically opposed to that, they just creamed me. This was the worst thing they'd ever heard. I took a bullet for Dr. Bowen, but he was later to come back in the meeting and say, well, I don't think that's such a bad idea, Mr. President, and this is why. He got 2 shots at the table. When you're a cabinet officer, you need to have alliances around that table to help you, because otherwise people are going to say, well, he gets the money and he doesn't, so I'm opposed to this. Later, interestingly, we failed at that time to agree to this program, but we gave it a try. But at the very end of the meeting, you know what Ronald Reagan said? He said, how did Mrs. Thatcher handle this? And so we went back and we looked at how Mrs. Thatcher had done a pamphlet about it, and she had distributed it in the UK. So the next meeting, we agree to a pamphlet, and that's because Mrs. Thatcher did it that way. So these are stories, these are war stories, but they take the temperature of the time. There will be future crises. The mentor is extremely important, and my advice on mentoring is find the best person you admire the most in the world and go to them and say, I want to carry your bag. I want to polish your shoes. I will work for free. Just let me be by your side. This particular professor, Carol Wilson was his name. I would pick him up at the airport at Logan and I'd drive him back to MIT. You know, I did everything. A year later, he asked me to edit a book. I did that. A year later, he asked me to be a research assistant. I did that. A year later, he asked me to be on his staff. I did that. And then he took responsibility for finding me my next job, because that's what mentors do. They not only train you, but if they're good, they will put you on the path to success. And in my term, you need to be a leader by the time you are 30. You know, therefore, one's 20s are extremely important. I think you'll find this in business too, when a chairman of a board finds a younger person they like and they put him into the corporate suite and so forth. They're training that leader to sustain their business. And that was the secret to my success. It doesn't happen when you're 50. You're either a success or you're not. But when you're 20, that critical choice of where you go to school, who you meet with, what courses you take, who you have as your mentor is the most important and valuable decision I ever made. One needs to be a commander of substance, preferably in one field. I was an energy expert, so I viewed the world in terms of energy. It gave me a ticket to see other dimensions of world dynamics. The other very, very important issue is methodology. Now let's take my methodology for President Reagan. When I was in the sit room, when I was chief of staff, I've used this same methodology for 4 presidents, including President Trump. And you have an example of it. It's called the National Security Calendar. When I came into the West Wing as a young economist, well, 32, and I was responsible for all of national security, not just economics, I was overwhelmed. It's too much. It's too much, from terrorism to Cold War to Contras in Nicaragua. I knew nothing of this. But then I realized something very important. The president doesn't know about it either. I mean, presidents, leaders don't come in trained, right? They don't come in trained. So how do you train a president? And how do you give them a sense of the future? I mentioned the video is very important because they see visually. I mentioned time is very important because if President Reagan is going to China in 1984, I want to start talking about the trip the summer before. It's like if you and I are taking a holiday together with our family, whatever. Oh, I'm going to China next year. I begin to pick up the subconscious here and begin everything that's related to China, I'll pick up. As opposed to a president going to China with a big briefing book, looking at it for the first day, the day before, right? So I realized at the time, start early because you're only going to get so much time to brief a president on an issue, maybe 3 hours. So how do you divide your 3 hours over 6 months? Right? You know, maybe you start with a little memo a year before, you build up. I would do a thematic paper for a president 2 months before the trip, and then I would do the video, and then I did the 3x5 cards, right? The 3x5 cards. We did China in 10 cards. And it's always the same. It's a matter of taking information, highly complex information, and reducing it. Same way for the president's schedule. I once had it when I was president of the University for Peace. My counselor was the president of Switzerland, a lady named Ruth Dreyfus, lovely lady. We talked about being president in her country. She was the first female president. She said, maybe 70% of my time is determined the year before. So I realized that was the same of the president. So I would take the year before and I would do a year calendar for President Reagan, and he could begin to see the dynamics of his schedule. The G7 always meets in July. The UN always meets in October. The World Bank always meets in September. NATO has a meeting here. And I constructed a calendar. Did the same thing for President Trump. May 2016. And you have a copy of it. I took the year 2017. I started January to December. And then the top 12 foreign policy objectives. Do you know that when we met with the Soviets, we got the essence of our message down to 16 words? 16, right? Because you need, again, huge information, 16 words. I did a speech on this, a radio address for Reagan in 1984 that became a bestseller and set the tone for the Reagan-Gorbachev meeting because I identified 4 themes that we used. So with Trump, what do you say about Trump? You know, what do you say? What do you say about China? What do you say about North Korea? What do you say about Putin? What do you say about global environment? What do you, in 2 words, 3 words? You know, channel China was my word for China. Channel China. We're not going to block China. We're not going to beat China. You know, we're going to have to channel China. And then what are your 4 sub-themes? And then how do you put that into a calendar? When should you meet with Xi, for example? When should we have a policy paper on China? How do we get the CIA to do an analysis of China and the options that we face? So you basically have 12 subjects and you run the National Security Council that way because there will be unpredictable events in business too. But you have to go in with your game plan and do it. So the National Security Calendar, I've done that for every president. And Trump, I think, is the most interesting because if you look at the National Security Calendar that I've provided you, you will see it's not far off. It's not far off from what was in the original because it's common sense. It's common sense. It's not, I'm not a genius here. I had a deputy director of the CIA, David Cohen, who was also deputy police commissioner of New York after 9/11. He helped me on this, smart guy. You get smart people, get really smart people. Doesn't have to be a lot of people. And why is that an advantage? How can I do that from the outside with Trump? How can I do that and not be in the government? Well, if you're in the government, you're constrained. You're constrained by the interagency process. You have to work with people. You have to clear papers and so forth. But if you're outside the system, 2 or 3 good minds can beat a government committee any day, really. But the issue is then how do you get it to the president? How do you get that information from outside to the president? Well, you need good friends like Secretary Pompeo, for example, or Vice President Pence. Right now, I'll give you another example, COVID-19, this concern about WHO. I said, well, why don't you just give money? Why doesn't the G7 just do a program for Africa the way that we do the AIDS program? Let's do COVID-19. Let's do it together. Let's try to save Africa together from this horrible disease. You know, you have ideas, you slip these ideas into the system, and then somebody big like Pompeo says it, and you've won. So this is how you affect change from outside the system. I still work for the government, I think. I mean, I work for Informa as well, and I'm very proud of it. And Informa allows me to do this because they know it's a good thing. If you take Stephen Carter, he was a minister. He was head of 10 Downing Street. He gets it. He gets this. He gets the world of public policy, and he gets the world of business. And actually, those are rather rare traits to kind of move between the two, because in the private sector, you have to make money. You have to make change. You have to anticipate. Life is tough in the private sector, as we're learning. There are winners and there are losers. So whether it's a manager of government or manager of business, the same set of skills, I think, apply. Well, you know, when you're working with the president, you have to travel a lot. And even if it's a day-to-day trip, if he goes to a meat packing factory, the White House situation has to go with him, and the National Security Advisor has to go with him, because in 13 minutes, the Russians could hit the White House with a nuclear missile. So wherever you are, you need to be able to respond. So that was one of the reasons as national security aide, I would travel on many, many days. Well, one day it was my birthday, and we were going to Ohio, and it was my 35th birthday. And the president knew it was my birthday. He was taking me away from his family and so forth. So he gave me a birthday party on Air Force One, and he gave me a present. And you know what he said? He said, Bill, he says, usually I don't trust anybody under 70. But he said, you're halfway there. Well, now in 3 months, I'm going to be 70. And so I look upon this 35 years, it goes so fast. 35 to 70, it's like the blink of an eye. It's like the blink of the eye. He knew that. He was a great guy. He was an Irishman, of course. We went to Ballyporeen, which was his ancestral home together. There was a Ronald Reagan pub there in his honor. And in fact, they've taken that pub and they put it in the Reagan Library in California. No, he was one of the great presidents we'll ever have.